The morning sun streamed through the massive windows of the Whitmore mansion, casting long shadows across the marble floors. In the grand master bedroom on the third floor, 17-year-old Isabella Whitmore sat in her custom-made wheelchair, staring out at the sprawling gardens below. The same view she had seen every morning for the past 12 years, ever since the accident that had changed everything. Isabella's father, Richard Whitmore, was one of the wealthiest men in America. His technology empire had made him billions, but all the money in the world couldn't fix his daughter's broken spine. At least, that's what every doctor had told them. Dozens of specialists, countless surgeries, experimental treatments from around the globe. Nothing had worked. Isabella's legs remained motionless, her dreams of dancing, running, and simply walking seeming impossible. The Whitmore household ran like a well-oiled machine. Staff members moved quietly through the halls, maintaining the pristine condition of the 40-room mansion. Isabella had her own team of caregivers, physical therapists, and tutors. Everything was scheduled, everything was perfect, and everything felt empty to the young woman who longed for something more than the golden cage that surrounded her. That Tuesday morning started like any other, until Margaret Williams walked through the front door. She was a 45-year-old woman from the south side of Chicago, wearing a simple blue dress and carrying a small suitcase. Her hair was pulled back neatly, and her brown eyes held a warmth that seemed to light up the entire entrance hall. Margaret had been hired as the new housekeeping supervisor, but she had no idea that her arrival would change everything. Richard Whitmore barely glanced up from his phone when Margaret was introduced to him. He was too busy with a conference call about his latest acquisition to pay attention to yet another employee. His wife, Patricia, gave Margaret a polite but distant welcome before hurrying off to her charity luncheon. In the Whitmore household, staff were expected to be invisible, efficient, and silent. But Margaret was different. As she was shown around the mansion by Mrs. Henderson, the head housekeeper, she noticed something that others seemed to ignore. Through the large windows, she could see a young woman in a wheelchair on the garden terrace. The girl sat alone, book in her lap, but she wasn't reading. Instead, she was watching the birds that gathered around the fountain, her face filled with longing. "That's Miss Isabella," Mrs. Henderson whispered, following Margaret's gaze. "The master's daughter. Poor thing has been in that chair since she was 5. Terrible accident, you know. We're not supposed to bother her unless she asks for something." Margaret nodded, but something stirred in her heart as she watched the lonely figure on the terrace. She had raised 4 children of her own, working multiple jobs to support them after her husband died in Iraq. She recognized the look in Isabella's eyes. It was the same expression her youngest son had worn after he broke his leg and was confined to bed for months. It wasn't just physical pain. It was the ache of feeling trapped, forgotten, and hopeless. The first few days passed quietly as Margaret learned her duties. She supervised the cleaning staff, managed the household supplies, and made sure everything met the Whitmore family's exacting standards. But every day, she found herself looking out at the terrace where Isabella spent most of her time. The young woman had a parade of caregivers and therapists, but Margaret noticed that she rarely smiled. She seemed to be going through the motions of living without actually experiencing life. On Friday afternoon, Margaret was organizing the linen closet when she heard the sound of crying echoing through the hallway. Following the sound, she discovered it was coming from Isabella's room. The door was slightly open, and Margaret could see the young woman sitting by her window, tears streaming down her face. Her physical therapist had just left, and on the floor lay a set of parallel bars that had been set up for walking exercises. Margaret's heart broke as she watched Isabella stare at those bars with a mixture of anger and despair. She had seen that same look in her own mirror years ago, when she thought she would never be able to provide for her children, never be able to give them the life they deserved. But she had learned something important during those dark times. Sometimes the impossible becomes possible when someone believes in you. Taking a deep breath, Margaret knocked gently on the door frame. "Miss Isabella, may I come in?" Isabella quickly wiped her tears and turned her wheelchair toward the door. "I'm fine," she said, her voice shaky. "You don't need to clean in here right now." But Margaret didn't move. Instead, she stepped into the room and closed the door behind her. "I'm not here to clean, honey. I'm here because I heard you crying, and I know what that sounds like." Isabella was surprised by the woman's directness. Most of the staff treated her like she was made of glass, speaking in hushed tones and avoiding eye contact. But Margaret looked straight at her with genuine concern and warmth. "You don't understand," Isabella said, gesturing toward the parallel bars. "Everyone keeps trying to help me walk, but it's impossible. I've been in this chair for 12 years. The doctors say I'll never walk again. My spine is too damaged." Margaret walked over to the parallel bars and ran her hand along the smooth metal. "You know, when my youngest son Marcus broke his leg in 3 places, the doctors said he might never run again. He was going to be a football player, had a scholarship, and everything. He spent months in bed, getting weaker and more depressed every day." Isabella listened, curious despite herself. No one had ever talked to her like this before, like she was a normal person with normal problems. "What happened to him?" Isabella asked. "Well, at first he did exactly what you're doing right now. He gave up. He stopped trying, stopped believing, stopped hoping. But you know what changed everything?" Margaret sat down in the chair across from Isabella, looking directly into her eyes. "Someone started believing in him when he couldn't believe in himself." "Did he walk again?" Margaret smiled. "He did more than walk. Last year, he won the state championship in track and field. Doctors said it was impossible, but Marcus didn't listen to them. He listened to his heart instead." Isabella felt something shift inside her chest, a tiny spark of something she hadn't felt in years. Hope was dangerous, she knew. She had hoped so many times before, only to have her dreams crushed by the harsh reality of her condition. But there was something different about Margaret, something that made Isabella want to believe that maybe, just maybe, things could change. "The doctors have tried everything," Isabella said softly. "Surgery, therapy, experimental treatments. My father has spent millions trying to fix me." Margaret leaned forward, her voice gentle but firm. "Maybe the problem isn't that you're broken, honey. Maybe the problem is that everyone's been trying to fix you instead of helping you heal." Those words hit Isabella like a thunderbolt. In all the years of treatments and therapy, no one had ever made that distinction before. Everyone saw her as a problem to be solved, a puzzle to be figured out, a tragedy to be endured. But Margaret was suggesting something different, that healing might be possible even when fixing wasn't. "What do you mean?" Isabella asked. "Your body knows how to heal itself, sweet girl. Sometimes it just needs the right encouragement, the right environment, the right person believing in it. I'm not a doctor, and I'm not promising you miracles. But I am promising you that if you want to try, really try, I'll be here every step of the way." Isabella felt tears welling up again. But this time they weren't tears of despair. They were tears of possibility. For the first time in years, someone was offering her hope without making promises they couldn't keep. Margaret wasn't saying she would definitely walk again. She was saying that the journey toward healing was worth taking, regardless of the destination. "Why would you want to help me?" Isabella asked. "You barely know me." Margaret reached out and gently took Isabella's hand. "Because I see you, honey. Really see you. Not the wheelchair, not the money, not the tragedy. I see a young woman who has dreams and hopes and so much life left to live. And sometimes that's all it takes to start a miracle." That evening, after Margaret had gone home to her own family, Isabella sat in her room thinking about their conversation. She looked at the parallel bars with new eyes, wondering if maybe they weren't instruments of torture after all. Maybe they were tools of possibility. The next morning, Margaret arrived early for work. She found Isabella already awake, sitting by her window and watching the sunrise. When she saw Margaret, Isabella smiled, the first real smile Margaret had seen from her. "Good morning, Miss Isabella," Margaret said warmly. "Good morning, Margaret," Isabella replied. Then, after a moment's hesitation, she added, "I've been thinking about what you said yesterday, about healing instead of fixing." Margaret sat down beside her. "And what do you think?" Isabella took a deep breath. "I think I want to try. I don't know if it will work, and I'm scared of being disappointed again. But I want to try." Margaret's face lit up with joy. "That's all we need, honey. Just the willingness to try." From that day forward, everything began to change. Margaret started spending her breaks with Isabella, not as a caregiver or therapist, but as a friend. They talked about everything. Isabella's dreams of becoming a writer, Margaret's stories about raising her children, their shared love of old movies and good books. But, more importantly, Margaret began to see possibilities where others saw limitations. She noticed that Isabella had some sensation in her legs, even though she couldn't move them voluntarily. She observed that Isabella's posture and muscle tone were better on some days than others. Most significantly, she saw that Isabella's spirit grew stronger every day they spent together. Margaret began to research everything she could about spinal cord injuries and recovery. She read medical journals in the library, talked to nurses she knew from her previous jobs, and even reached out to specialists who were working on cutting-edge treatments. But her most important discovery wasn't medical, it was personal. She realized that Isabella had been surrounded by people who meant well but who had unconsciously given up hope. The doctors, therapists, and caregivers had all accepted the diagnosis and focused on helping Isabella adapt to her limitations rather than challenging them. Even Isabella's parents, despite their love and wealth, had settled into a routine of managing her condition rather than fighting it. Margaret understood that healing required more than medical intervention. It required belief, determination, and, most importantly, love. She had seen it in her own family, in her community, and in her own life. Sometimes the most powerful medicine wasn't found in a hospital or pharmacy, but in the heart of someone who refused to give up. As the weeks passed, Margaret began to introduce small changes to Isabella's routine. Instead of just sitting by the window, they would go outside to the garden every day. Margaret would tell stories while Isabella enjoyed the fresh air and sunshine. They would do gentle stretches together, with Margaret encouraging Isabella to focus on how her body felt rather than what it couldn't do. Margaret also began to challenge some of the assumptions that had been made about Isabella's care. She questioned why certain exercises were done in certain ways, why Isabella's wheelchair was positioned at certain angles, why some movements were avoided entirely. She approached these questions not with arrogance, but with genuine curiosity and a fresh perspective. The other staff members began to notice the change in Isabella's demeanor. She seemed happier, more engaged, more alive. Mrs. Henderson mentioned to Margaret that Isabella had been asking for books about adventure and travel, subjects she had avoided for years. The cook noticed that Isabella's appetite had improved significantly. But the most significant change was in Isabella's eyes. The empty 3 weeks had passed since Margaret Williams first walked into the Whitmore mansion, and the changes in Isabella were becoming impossible to ignore. The young woman who had once spent her days staring listlessly out the window now eagerly awaited Margaret's arrival each morning. Their friendship had blossomed into something beautiful and unexpected, but, more importantly, it had awakened something powerful within Isabella's spirit. Margaret had been quietly implementing her own approach to Isabella's care, working around the established routines and medical protocols. Every morning, after completing her housekeeping duties, she would spend time with Isabella in the garden. They had moved beyond simple conversations and gentle stretches to more focused activities that Margaret believed could help stimulate Isabella's nervous system. The breakthrough came on a Thursday morning that started like any other. Isabella was sitting in her usual spot in the garden when Margaret approached with an unusual request. She had been reading about neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to form new neural pathways, and had learned about a technique that combined mental visualization with physical therapy. Isabella, honey, I want to try something different today, Margaret said, pulling up a chair beside the wheelchair. I want you to close your eyes and imagine that you're standing up. Isabella looked skeptical. Margaret, I've done visualization exercises before with my therapists. They never work. This is different, Margaret insisted. I'm not asking you to imagine that you can walk. I'm asking you to remember what it felt like when you could walk. Think back to when you were 5 years old, before the accident. Do you remember running in this very garden? Isabella closed her eyes, and, for a moment, her face transformed. She was remembering something beautiful, something she had buried deep in her mind to protect herself from the pain of loss. I remember chasing butterflies, she whispered. I remember the feeling of grass under my bare feet. Good, Margaret said softly. Now, while you hold on to that memory, I want you to try to send that feeling down to your legs. Don't try to move them, just try to remember them. As Isabella focused on the memory, something extraordinary happened. Her breathing deepened, her posture straightened, and, For just a moment, Margaret could swear she saw the tiniest movement in Isabella's left foot. It was so small that it could have been imagination, but Margaret had been watching Isabella carefully for weeks, and she was certain she had seen something. "Isabella," Margaret said, barely containing her excitement. "Did you feel anything just now?" Isabella opened her eyes, confusion and hope battling across her face. I thought I felt something. But that's impossible. I haven't felt anything in my legs for 12 years. Margaret's heart raced, but she forced herself to remain calm. She had seen enough small miracles in her life to know that the biggest mistake would be to get too excited too quickly. "Let's try it again," she said. "But this time, I want you to also think about all the places you want to go, all the things you want to do." They spent the next hour working on the visualization exercise. Each time, Isabella seemed to connect more deeply with her body, and each time, Margaret was almost certain she could see tiny, almost imperceptible movements in Isabella's legs and feet. By the end of the session, both women were exhausted but exhilarated. "Margaret," Isabella said as they prepared to go inside, "something is happening. I don't understand it, and I'm afraid to believe it, but something is definitely happening." That evening, Margaret went home to her small apartment on the south side of Chicago with her mind racing. She called her eldest daughter, Sarah, who was studying nursing at the community college. "Mama, what you're describing sounds like the kind of thing we study in neurology class," Sarah said over the phone. "Sometimes when there's a spinal cord injury, the damage isn't as complete as doctors think. There can be dormant neural pathways that might be awakened under the right circumstances. But, honey, the doctors said her injury was complete. They said she would never walk again. Doctors are human, Mama. They make mistakes, and medical science is always discovering new things. Maybe Miss Isabella's injury wasn't as complete as they thought. Maybe her nervous system just needed the right kind of stimulation to start working again." Margaret hung up the phone feeling more hopeful than ever. She spent the rest of the evening researching spinal cord injuries, reading everything she could find about incomplete injuries, neural regeneration, and recovery cases that had defied medical expectations. The next morning, Margaret arrived at work early and found Isabella already waiting for her in the garden. The young woman's eyes were bright with anticipation, and Margaret could tell that she had been thinking about their session from the day before. "I dreamed about walking last night," Isabella said as soon as she saw Margaret. "For the first time in 12 years, I had a dream where I was walking, not in a memory, but in the present. I was walking through this garden, and I could feel everything. The sun on my face, the breeze in my hair, the ground beneath my feet." Margaret felt goosebumps rise on her arms. "That's a very good sign, honey. The mind and body are connected in ways we don't fully understand. If your brain is starting to dream about walking, maybe it's also starting to remember how to send signals to your legs." They began their session with the visualization exercise, but this time, Margaret added something new. She had brought a small vibrating massager that she gently applied to Isabella's legs while she concentrated on the memories and sensations. The combination of mental focus and physical stimulation seemed to amplify whatever was happening in Isabella's nervous system. 20 minutes into the session, something remarkable occurred. As Isabella focused on remembering the sensation of running, her left leg suddenly jerked slightly. Both women saw it clearly, and this time there was no doubt about what had happened. Isabella gasped, her eyes flying open. "Did you see that? Did my leg actually move?" Margaret was crying with joy, but she managed to keep her voice steady. "Yes, honey, I saw it. Your leg moved. It really moved." For the next several minutes, they tried to reproduce the movement, but nothing happened. Isabella began to feel frustrated, worried that it had been a fluke or that she had imagined it. But Margaret remained calm and encouraging. "Honey, think about this," Margaret said. 3 weeks ago, you couldn't feel anything in your legs at all. Yesterday, you started feeling sensations. Today, your leg moved. That's not coincidence. That's progress. Real, measurable progress. Over the following days, the movements became more frequent and more deliberate. Isabella began to regain sensation in both legs, starting with tingling feelings and progressing to actual touch sensitivity. Margaret continued to work with her every day, combining visualization, gentle massage, and increasingly more complex exercises. But they kept their progress secret. Margaret knew that if word got out too early, Isabella would be subjected to a barrage of medical examinations, skeptical doctors, and raised expectations that might interfere with the delicate process that was unfolding. She had seen enough hope crushed by premature medical intervention to know that sometimes the best medicine was patience and privacy. Isabella agreed to keep their work confidential, though it was becoming increasingly difficult to hide her growing excitement and energy. Her parents began to notice that she seemed happier and more engaged, but they attributed it to her friendship with Margaret rather than any physical improvement. The real test came on a Monday morning 3 weeks later. Margaret arrived at work to find Isabella waiting for her with an expression of barely contained excitement. "Margaret, I have to tell you something," Isabella said, her voice trembling. "Last night, I was lying in bed, and I was thinking about our exercises. I tried to move my legs, and they moved. Not just little jerks or twitches, actual, deliberate movement." Margaret felt her heart skip a beat. "Show me," she said simply. Isabella positioned herself in her wheelchair so that her legs were clearly visible. She closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and concentrated. Slowly, deliberately, her left leg lifted several inches off the footrest. Then, her right leg did the same thing. The movements were shaky and required tremendous effort, but they were unmistakably voluntary. Margaret had to sit down to keep from falling over. In all her research and hoping and praying, she had never dared to believe that such dramatic progress was possible. "Isabella," she whispered, "do you realize what this means?" "I think it means I might be able to walk again," Isabella said, tears streaming down her face. "For the first time in 12 years, I think I might actually be able to walk again." But their celebration was interrupted by the sound of footsteps approaching. Richard Whitmore was walking through the garden, phone pressed to his ear as usual, heading toward the house. Both women quickly composed themselves, with Isabella dropping her legs back onto the footrest, and Margaret pretending to arrange the flowers in a nearby planter. As Richard passed by, he glanced at his daughter and Margaret, but didn't seem to notice anything unusual. He was too absorbed in his business call to pay attention to what was happening right in front of him. After he disappeared into the house, both women released the breath they had been holding. "We have to tell them," Isabella said. "My parents need to know what's happening." But Margaret shook her head. "Not yet, honey. I know this is exciting, and I know you want to share the good news, but we need to be smart about this. Your father is going to want to bring in doctors and specialists, and they might want to change everything we're doing. Right now, what we're doing is working. Let's not fix something that isn't broken." Isabella understood the wisdom in Margaret's words, but the secret was becoming a heavy burden. She was making progress that defied medical explanation, and she was doing it with a woman who had no medical training but who possessed something that all the doctors had lacked: unwavering faith and genuine love. Over the next 2 weeks, Isabella's progress accelerated dramatically. She regained strength in her leg muscles, developed better control over her movements, and even began to feel sensation in her feet. Margaret introduced new exercises, including attempts to bear weight while holding onto the parallel bars that had sat and used in Isabella's room for so long. The first time Isabella was able to support her own weight, even for just a few seconds, both women cried with joy. It was a moment that represented not just physical progress, but the triumph of hope over despair, faith over fear, and love over limitation. "Margaret," Isabella said as she sat back down in her wheelchair, exhausted but exhilarated, "I need you to know that whatever happens, you've already given me the greatest gift anyone could give. You've given me back my hope." Margaret hugged the young woman tightly. "Honey, I didn't give you anything. Everything you needed was already inside you. I just helped you remember how to find it." As the weeks continued, their bond deepened beyond friendship into something that resembled a mother-daughter relationship. Margaret shared stories about her own children, her struggles as a single mother, and her faith that had sustained her through the darkest times. Isabella opened up about her years of depression, her feelings of being a burden to her family, and her dreams for the future that she was finally allowing herself to have again. One afternoon, as they worked together in the garden, Isabella asked the question that had been on her mind for weeks. Margaret, why do you think this is working when nothing else did? Margaret paused in her gardening and looked thoughtfully at Isabella. I think it's working because for the first time, someone believed in you without needing proof. All those doctors and therapists, they needed to see evidence before they could have hope. But sometimes, hope has to come first. Sometimes, believing in the impossible is what makes it possible. Isabella nodded, understanding that Margaret was talking about more than just medical recovery. She was talking about the power of unconditional faith, the kind of love that sees potential where others see problems, and the courage to pursue dreams that everyone else has given up on. As the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the garden, both women felt that they were approaching a moment of truth. Isabella was getting stronger every day, and soon it would be impossible to hide her progress. The time was coming when they would have to share their secret with the world, and both of them were both excited and terrified about what that moment would bring. But, for now, in the quiet of the garden, surrounded by the beauty and peace that had become the setting for a modern miracle, they continued their work together. One exercise at a time, one movement at a time, one hope at a time, they were proving that sometimes the impossible really can become possible. Nest that had haunted them for so long was being replaced by something that looked remarkably like hope. She began to ask questions about her condition that she had never asked before. She wanted to understand exactly what had happened to her spine, what the possibilities were for recovery, what new treatments might be available. Margaret encouraged every question, every spark of curiosity. She helped Isabella research her condition online, connect with other spinal cord injury survivors, and explore treatment options that the family had never considered. But, most importantly, she helped Isabella believe that her life could be more than what it had been. One afternoon, as they sat in the garden sharing a picnic lunch, Isabella looked at Margaret with wonder in her eyes. You know, I haven't felt this hopeful in years. I had forgotten what it was like to look forward to tomorrow. Margaret smiled and squeezed Isabella's hand. Hope is like a muscle, honey. The more you use it, the stronger it gets. And your hope muscle is getting very strong indeed. As the sun set that evening, casting golden light across the mansion's grounds, both women felt that they were standing at the beginning of something extraordinary. Neither of them knew exactly what lay ahead, but they both knew that the journey they were starting together would change their lives forever. The impossible was about to become possible, one day, one hope, one belief at a time.